Welcome to January of 2024, where most shitty horror films and a lot of other bad movies go to die when it comes to this time of the year. So we have Night Swim, which is directed by Bryce McGuire and written by McGuire as well, and stars Wyatt Russell, Kerry Condon, and among others. And this is based on a short film that was made by McGuire that came out over a decade ago. And in this story, it deals with a family that pretty much moves into a new house, and they discover that this whole swimming pool is pretty much haunted. And that's pretty much the gist of it. There's really nothing more than that. Now here's a little backstory. Now this movie was, like I said, directed by McGuire, who pretty much did the short film. And I haven't seen the short film, but apparently it was popular enough to get a film financed by James Wan, who also produced the film, and also through Blumhouse. And going from the trailers from this, I was already really not looking forward to it, because even from the trailers, I just kind of looked at it as just a very cheap, typical type of horror film that we get almost all the time when it comes to supernatural movies like this, especially coming from Blumhouse. And it just really seems like we've been on this trend lately where James Wan, who's been so busy doing other films, especially with his Aquaman franchise and stuff, and, not really directing really much horror films, it's like he's basically producing films like Megan that came out last year, and other films that really are trying to do like more original concepts and stuff, which I could see what they were going for, but I mean with the whole haunted pool stuff and everything. But even from the trailers, I just wasn't getting the gist of it, because it really just seemed like it was going to be one of those movies that was going to just deliver exactly what appeals to what we have with current modern horror cliches that we've seen countless times with a lot of other supernatural horror films. And the biggest basis coming from at least watching the film in its entirety is not only ripping off the Amityville Horror, but also Poltergeist in certain aspects, and also to an extent with It in certain scenes. And so going into this, I really knew exactly what I was getting into, but upon seeing it, I could say this was definitely worse than I thought it was. And it also was it's also one of the most boring horror films that I've seen that so far that James Wan has produced, that I didn't really care too much for. And to get in my pros, I will say that, okay, the cast in this, Wyatt Russell and Kerry Condon, they do fine. The rest of the cast, they do what they can, but I don't really have much to go into with their characters, because it gets into some stuff that I really don't really care too much for. But on performance-wise, they try to handle the material as best they can. Other than that, okay, there was probably there was one scene I will give it credit for that it's kind of jumping the gun, but there's a shot that involves there's a sequence involving pretty much a video recording of Wyatt Russell's character, who's a former baseball player in this, by the way, where it's pretty much, him, where it's playing Take Me Out to the Ball Game. That, in theory, could have been a good scene if it would have played more into something more set up and doing a better scare, but unfortunately, it's very ruined because the moment it turns into a typical jump scare. And also a very lazy sequence, I might add. The way it plays out, where you have pretty much, the scene pretty much ripping off not only The Shining, but also but also the Amityville Horror. Now, here's where I get into my cons. Now, where do I start with this piece of shit? So, the movie was already from the get-go really at a bad start when you have pretty much the opening scene that involves with a girl it's set in 1992, who's in the water, and she's all of a sudden just getting this little toy that she's trying to get out of the water. And already from the get-go, this has always been one of the things I've always really disliked with a lot of supernatural films, is how characters, when they see weird shit happening, the way they react and their decisions make it get themselves into more trouble. Where the girl is trying to get this little toy boat out of the water and stuff, and for a moment you think that she's going to basically leave, and after she notices something happening when she's in the water, but then all of a sudden she just keeps going back to go after it, and then she gets pulled and stuff. And I was like, well, that's your own dumbass fault for getting it there. And that's not her. That's from a lot of other characters throughout the film that do that too, where they make really dumb decisions where, we'll get into more of the story, you have the family moving pretty much in, and Wyatt Russell and his family moving into the house, and they get the pool pretty much cleaned off and everything. And already from the get-go, it seems like they could have seen something suspicious, because we see that Wyatt Russell's character immediately gets his hand pulled into the pool, and he ends up like, later pretty much getting his hand wounded and stuff. And if I was me, and if I was in that situation where I started like getting all of a sudden grabbed with not knowing, I'd be really, question like, hey, this doesn't seem right or something like that. I wouldn't I wouldn't keep going and still trying to make it a fucking thing, And on top of that, going into the rest of it, they just feel like the movie is very padded out with a lot of stuff that I just wasn't really interested with. Because there's whole backstory that's involved with Wyatt Russell, where he's a former baseball player that had to retire due to a disease that he had and stuff. But honestly, they try to give him some layers to his character, but I didn't really give a shit because the movie kept going on and kept having stuff really padded out for the sake of it. Especially, there's a whole sequence where he's like playing baseball with these other kids and stuff, and all of a sudden it becomes a sports movie for some reason. I'm like, this feels really out of place, And I know that's still going to go into, I know he's a former baseball player and stuff, but the biggest problem with it is that there's really no payoff with a lot of these setups they do with it. I mean, and then you have other scenes where they're having like the swimming pool stuff going on, where they're having pool parties and stuff, and you just got a lot of stuff that's happening that really just feels very dragged out and plotted just to make it a long runtime that I really didn't give a shit about. And then they get into the worst part about it is the scares in this, because like you see in the trailer, when it comes to the stuff that involves with the scene with the Marco Polo part, where you have the daughter that's, spent time with her boyfriend and stuff. This scene, I already called where it was going, and I didn't feel any fucking tension or anything, or felt any scares, because not only did I feel like the movie was really playing it very dumb, because the whole scene is her pretty much having her eyes closed, not and hearing shit, mind you, and never once opens her fucking eyes. And I'm like, even at that age, if I was, playing Marco Polo and stuff, and I heard weird shit, I would open my fucking eyes, And then all of a sudden, she eventually gets like grabbed by this weird looking CGI or whatever ghost looking thing, and the weirdest thing is, these kind of ghosts they show, the CGI looked very laughable, and not in a good way. They look like, a very poorly done version of the pirate ghosts from Pirates of the Caribbean, Curse of Black Pearl. That's an insult to that. I'm just saying they kind of go for that kind of look that looks, but in a very worse way that's not as really good looking as those. Because these designs they have, I was looking at it and I was watching it like, okay, these fucking ghosts don't even look scary. They look like they belong in like an asylum movie or something, or look like they belong in like one of those parodies that you see of like something like this that would come out, like a scary movie parody, like a scary movie type of movie, just not in a serious horror film. And the way the movie goes along too, it really just seems like we're getting into territory that seems unnecessary, especially the stuff that's involved with their cat. That pretty much, well, spoilers, but it's pretty much in the trailer. The cat eventually gets killed and it goes missing, and they're looking for it and stuff. And the decisions that these characters keep going through, it's like, just leave the fucking house, or do something with the pool where you can either drain it or do something else, which they do that later. But the whole thing is that they don't. The kids already early catch on what's happening, but they never bother to tell the adults or anything. They just end up finding out for themselves, especially when they have this pool party scene that happens later. And it's like, use your fucking brain. And the only thing I will say that kind of has a little bit of a potential that it could have had is that there's a subplot involving where you have the wife pretty much going after to look for the missing girl that was from the beginning of the film, and we're introduced to the woman that used to live at the actual house, and it was the mother who is pretty much having going on with this disease and stuff, and she explains that essentially the water comes from pretty much a magic kind of area. It's coming from like some kind of like well or some kind of lake or whatever that it came from, and instead of it being pretty much like a horror thing, it's pretty much magic, and it can grant the ability for someone to have all the power or have the abilities to do whatever as long as they make a sacrifice. And I find this really stupid because this doesn't really have any kind of this doesn't really have much of a payoff in the right way. When we get into the later stuff involving where you have the climax involved, you have it where you get into the son is pretty much having the one to be sacrificed, and there's a part where he ends up going under the pool and he's underwater, and the wife is trying to save him and stuff. And there is an interesting idea that I think could have been handled a lot better, is the fact that the water in the inside is taking more effect too. That in theory could work, but unfortunately it's poorly executed because it's very, the way the movie plays it out, it comes into typical cheap scares, and they don't really take fully advantage of it by setting the stakes in a good manner, to where I felt much for the characters in the film. And when it comes to him pretty much trying to get saved, it's the dad pretty much goes crazy, and he ends up becoming like Jack Torrance from The Shining, or George Lutz from the Amityville Horror. Where this is also another thing I fucking hated too, was the way that it became more of a comedy in this sequence, where he's just continuously saying Marco Polo like the daughter was her. I'm like, is that really the kind of dialogue that really sounds, that's supposed to be giving you thrills and stuff? Just constantly keep saying Marco Polo. And the way that it's, and this is not really to blame the actor, but just the lines that they give Wyatt Russell in those scenes too was just very very out of place and over the top, that it really just seemed like, okay, this really seems like you're going in to sell parody. We get into the climax that involves him pretty much finally sacrificing himself and stuff, and it's very, quick and to the point, where he's just like, okay, well, I'm able to... And this is something I also really kind of question, too. The fact that he just spits out all the blood and stuff really fast after being, hit by a baseball bat from the daughter. And all of a sudden, he comes back to his senses and ends up sacrificing himself and goes to the water. And then we see later on where, after the family pretty much gets the pool drained out, they end up having him buried with gravel and with mud and stuff like that and dirt. But but then again, I'm also kind of questioning, how the fuck is that going to work? What if it rains? It's going to easily probably come through and stuff. A lot of stuff in this really doesn't make any sense. Not to mention, one of the other things is that I could call certain sequences that were happening where, especially toward the climax, where the boy is trying to go after that he thinks he hears the cat, which is a common thing throughout, where characters thinking that they can see stuff and hear other things. And we end up seeing it to where he's trying to get the cat, and then I called it while I was in the theater watching it, where I could see that something was going to pull on him. I'm like, man, you could really predict how a lot of this shit happens with this movie. The movie is just such a bore to sit through, especially with a lot of the pacing that feels very dragged out, a lot of the scares that really feel not earned. And in fact, there wasn't even one fucking scare in this movie I can think of that even got to me, or even close to it. This is one of those poor examples of how you don't do a horror film, especially if it's going to be in a swimming pool. There's actually, and I haven't seen it, but there was an episode a long time ago of a show called Are You Afraid of the Dark that had to deal with a haunted pool. And from what I've heard, that's actually the better version that they do with it. And I am kind of wondering if the short they made was actually inspired by that episode. So I might actually check that out, because I heard that that's actually how you do it the right way. And there's so much more that's really wrong with this. Like, the CGI is really awful. You have a lot of sequences, especially at points where it's very repetitive, where characters would be in the water and they would just be constantly calling out, like, is someone there? The same kind of shit that you see in countless other films. Not a good way. There's a lot more, but that's really the gist of it. So this is a really bad start to start out the new year. And with that, I'm going to give the movie a flat line on the Film Freaks meter. So, for those of you who have also seen Night Swim, and also seen the short film that's based on, let me know in the comments of what you thought about it. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next review. I'll see you later.